In recent months, the disappearance of Jack and Lilly has captured widespread attention, not just locally, but across the country and even internationally. As the search for answers continues, a new factor has begun to shape the investigation: the rapid rise of true crime content on platforms like YouTube and podcasts. These platforms have brought millions of people into the conversation, turning viewers into active participants. Tips are being shared, theories are spreading, and public interest continues to grow. But while this attention can help generate leads, it also raises serious concerns about misinformation, resource strain, and the impact on ongoing police work. So how exactly are these online discussions influencing real investigations? In this interview, a law enforcement officer provides rare insight into how true crime media affects cases like Jack and Lily's, from the benefits of increased public awareness to the challenges of separating fact from speculation. This is a closer look at the intersection of social media, true crime, and real-world investigations.
The rise in true crime podcasts and the rise in followings and people participating in our investigations, there is a benefit. There's for sure a benefit. We've seen the benefit on our investigations previously. The difficulty just becomes when people, take everything that comes out of these as proven fact.
Many YouTube shows, true crime shows, have been discussing the case of Lilly and Jack. In general, how can these types of shows impact a police investigation?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. You're right. Lilly and Jack is, it's two young children that are missing. So the draw is not just here at home, like it's all over the country. It's international, as you said. So it's a bit of a special circumstance, just given the attention to it. But there are a lot of our investigations, not just missing people, but homicide investigations that do draw quite a crowd. Especially we look at some of the like our cold cases, I suppose, if you want to refer to them that way. Obviously there's a lot of people that talk about them, people trying to find out information, that kind of stuff. The biggest difficulty that we have when it comes to information that's shared on podcasts, YouTube, that kind of thing, is that as much as some of the information may be accurate, a lot of it gets clouded in information that's not factual, so it's not based on any type of fact. In terms of for the police, when we're guiding where our investigations go, we have to operate in fact. And if we're dealing with information that may not be factual, we have to take, so every time a tip comes in, we have to take investigators that will then go look at that tip. We have to determine, one, is it relevant to our investigation? And two, what is the likelihood that this is factual information versus not factual? So if we look at things that are like, we know, this specific tip, the information that's included in it, we believe that information to be true based on other information we've gathered, or is it likely to be true, or is it unlikely to be true, or is it just not based in fact at all? Every single tip we get then has to be followed up on. Even if we don't believe it to be factually accurate, we still have to follow up. We still have to do our due diligence. So getting tips can move an investigation forward for sure. But when we start to get to the point where some misinformation and mistruths start to get shared on social media or on other platforms, and then that information comes to the police, we now have to put investigators on that information, which is taking people away from potentially chasing down actual real leads that are actually based in fact. So that's the complication that can come from that. So there is a benefit for sure, but there's also like anything, there's always there's pros and cons to anything, and that can be the difficulty with this kind of thing.
So you're saying that these types of shows do tend to generate an influx of tips?
Yep, absolutely they do. Yep.
Right, and they have in this case?
Yep.
Right. You mentioned there's the pros and cons. Mm-hmm. Articulate what the pros could be.
Yep. So for example, in looking at other investigations in the past. So we've received tips that basically would suggest to us that a certain person that was not known to investigators may be involved. And while we, at the time, we may not have anything to suggest that person factually, based in fact, is involved, there is a potential likelihood because they have an association to the principal parties involved in our investigation. So we'll go down that path, and sometimes that'll lead us to somebody that we wouldn't have known about before had it not been for that tip. So that's a huge pro. That's great for us. But then we get the flip side where it's a person who may have crossed paths with one of our principal parties 15 years ago, and a rumor or something that's not based in fact gets shared on a platform that then it grows into this huge thing where people are sharing it constantly. The more it's shared, the more people believe that it's actually factual, and then that comes to us, and now we're left to have to chase down this lead that has nothing to do with our investigation at all. But because it was shared so many times, there's a lot of credence that's given to the fact that, well, this must be true because it's been shared by 1,500, 2,000, 100,000 people, whatever the case may be. So it's just those are the pros and cons that we have to manage when we're getting these tips.
And as you mentioned, that all ties up a lot of police resources.
It can,
so talk about that impact.
Yeah, so obviously it depends on each investigation. Looking specifically at our major crime investigations, these investigations do generally tend to span longer periods of time, sometimes months, even years. It's not uncommon to have 100+ investigators involved through the life of the file, basically looking at information or trying to direct us where that investigation is going to go. When we get these influx of tips, that is people that we could be potentially sending out to go interview somebody, or perhaps there's a piece of evidence that we need to go collect. It just begins to kind of limit the pool of people that we have available. Now that said, if these tips are based in fact, then absolutely, that's a good dedication and a good use of resources to send our people to go do that stuff. It's when we get these tips that we know that they're not based in fact, or they're unlikely to be based in fact, we still have to send people to that. So now we're taking people away that could be doing something to benefit the investigation, to move the investigation forward. We're now sending them to go do something that we know it's not based in fact, but we have to ensure that we've proven that it's not accurate, because our burden is not to the court of public opinion. Our burden is to the courts, and the criminal courts. It's obviously the burden of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt, and we need to ensure that we're not just picking the evidence that builds that is positive for our case. We also have to exclude and ensure that there's no evidence that would send us down a different path, as a different avenue, as a defense avenue, those kinds of things, right? So we just have to be. It's just one of those things of management of resources, and it can tie up a lot of people, sometimes for a long time, for things that we know are not accurate, but we don't have a choice. We have to do our due diligence. We have to chase that down.
Given that the rise of the true crime community being more participatory in this day and age, talk about that as it pertains to police investigations. Is this seen as a good thing, a bad thing, or is it are you of two minds?
Yeah, I think from my standpoint, I think just the dawn of not just true crime, but social media generally, like we're much more interconnected than we were even 15 years ago when I started policing. Facebook and these kinds of things were just beginning to grow in popularity compared to what they are now. And just the way that we get our information, just generally, a lot of that information comes from these platforms. And even for yourselves as journalists, there are people that are beginning to go away from that, which also makes your guys' jobs very, very difficult. And we're in that same boat. So for me, like from my personal experience, the rise in true crime podcasts and the rise in followings and people participating in our investigations, there is a benefit. There's for sure a benefit. We've seen the benefit on our investigations previously. The difficulty just becomes when people, take everything that comes out of these as proven fact, when often there's very little that's done to actually prove that any of the information is actually factual, right? Like as a police officer and as an investigator, we have to corroborate every single piece of information that we have to either say that yes, this is accurate, or no, it's not. True crime podcasts, documentaries, these kinds of things, they're not necessarily held to the same standards. So it makes it that's the difficulty that comes from that, right? So you're looking at one, and it's not just that, there's also the monetization of, people are doing these things, and it's great. Everybody obviously needs to earn a living. That's not, I don't have any difficulty with that. It's just when we're talking about people that are doing these things, they're obviously trying to monetize it and trying to earn money for themselves. And that can obviously sometimes cloud the issue, and especially when we get to this fact-based, driven discussion that we're trying to have. And people that want to participate and have that discussion with us, we're more than happy to. They're like, absolutely. It's just this, difficulty with things that are not fact-based.
So the message would be to the public would be to be aware that these types of shows don't have the same standards that the police do, that journalists do,
Exactly.
that not to take these things as fact.
Exactly, right? So everything that the police is doing has to be based in fact. Same thing for you as journalists. Everything has to be based in fact. Not just beyond trying to do our jobs, but the ethics associated to that has to be based in fact. And unfortunately, when you get into people that are starting off their own venture, they're doing this out of their home, or it's a private venture. Most things come from a good place, and they're trying to help. It's just the difficulty of having that understanding that the information that you share, once it's out into the world, it's very difficult to control where that information goes, and sometimes it grows, and then it comes to you as either journalists or to us as the police, and we're now left with having to actually make the determination: is this factual? Is this accurate? When it's perhaps at the forefront somebody who's involved in that type of a podcast or that platform. If they have the ability to do their due diligence immediately, then it might actually be helpful and beneficial to us that we have a better understanding that the information coming to us may actually already be factual, because someone has just done a little bit of fact checking just to ensure that it's not some theory that really has no basis or foundation in fact.
You've mentioned that YouTube shows have generated tips in this investigation. Is there anything else you can point to in how YouTube true crime shows have impacted the investigation of Lilly and Jack?
So that's a hard one, because I'm not completely other than doing the interviews and the few things, and I've chased down some of these tips, but beyond that, I don't have the day-to-day knowledge to answer that question for you. That's a hard one, sorry.
Are these types of shows something that police monitor outside of receiving these tips?
No, not generally, because there's just so many of them. I think it would be very difficult to, outside of the work that we're doing day to day, it would be something that we would need to do in our off hours, and there's just only so many hours in a day. So no, it's not generally something that we monitor. Of course, if something is being widely shared, then we're people too. So the odds are, even in our personal lives, we might have seen this information, and we're like, okay, that may be something that we need to look into, because this actually may be factual. You're at home, kids are running around the backyard, and you're just scrolling, and you see something on Facebook or YouTube, whatever the case may be, and you think, oh, that actually might be relevant. We need to perhaps look at that. So that for sure happens, but it's not something that we're actively monitoring or looking at. No.
Right. Some family members have expressed that they're turning to these types of platforms amid a lack of answers in this case. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I think that's the difficult balance. So it's not even just cases that are continuing to be under investigation and can be for a very long time. It's also cases that are before the court. We have to be very careful with the information that we share publicly, of course. But the information that we provide to families, of course, we provide them more information than we do generally with the public. I think that goes without saying. But any information that we ultimately share, like anything, once it's out into the world, we don't have control with where that information goes anymore. So it's a very difficult balancing act for our family liaison officers to try and manage. This is what we know, but we also have to be very careful, because this piece of evidence may relate back to a specific piece of evidence that other people may not be aware of. And now if that's out in the world, then we have difficulty with kind of controlling the knowledge of this evidence and perhaps strategically how we're going to use that in our investigations. So there's just all these things for us it's a very, very delicate balancing act. Of course, we're people too. We would love to be able to provide all of the information at a moment's notice to everybody at all times. But unfortunately, our mandate and what we're trying to get to is we're ultimately trying to either find somebody who's missing, trying to get justice for somebody who's been harmed, a murder victim, even not looking at major crime investigations, but other just more, I suppose, run-of-the-mill investigations like assaults, those kinds of things. Our job is to try and get some form of justice for survivors of these types of things, or for victims. And releasing too much information, providing too much information may be counterproductive to that end. So the information that we do share is basically being done in such a way to try and especially to families, try and give them at least some understanding of what's happening. but also trying to protect that investigation that directly relates to their loved one in order to not, potentially jeopardize something, and then we're just completely unable to actually solve what happened, because that would be worse, I think, in my view, than I'd rather get less information, but the police can do their job and potentially get justice for my loved one than they told me too much, and now the investigation's jeopardized, and there's nothing more that can be done. Is
there any other scenarios where these types of shows can benefit police and investigations?
Yeah, absolutely there is. I think especially if we look at documentaries, there's been documentaries about some of our older files in the past, and some of these documentaries or podcasts even about some of our other files, there is it's getting that information to a new audience that may not necessarily be on social media, who's not getting that information or doesn't know that this thing has happened. And from that, we then get new tips from people that otherwise wouldn't be participating, I suppose is probably the best word to use. So there's definitely a benefit. For me, from my opinion, I guess the biggest thing in my experience is that there is a big benefit. But it's like anything, there's risk and reward to anything that we do. Even outside of policing, just generally life, there's risk reward to everything. It's just about managing the information that's not factual. That's where the difficulty comes with this, and it's having to take people away from chasing down potentially factual information that have to also deal with this non-factual information. That's really all it is. That's just the biggest con is that. But I personally think that there's a huge upside to it.
And is there a situation or case that you can point to help the public understand what the benefits can be, a sort of practical example of that playing out?
Yeah. Great example actually. So a few months ago, on the Esther Johns investigation specifically, there was somebody so this one didn't actually come out of true crime, but they were aware of this person was aware of the case just by following social media and following our updates, the updates from media, and then also just chatter in the community. There was an item that was the person just happened to be walking, I believe, or was driving through the area, observed down by a riverbed, just down in Greenwood, and they called the office here because they knew to call the office here, and we went down and we were able to seize that item. We're still obviously trying to understand how that item fits into the overall investigation, but that's something that had this person perhaps not been aware of this incident that occurred in the area by virtue of just following the information that's being shared on social media, they may not have thought that may or may not be relevant. They may just never have called. So, like I said, I really think that there is a benefit to it. It's just a matter of managing the good with the bad. That's really all it is.
It sounds like it really just does raise the profile of the case, yep, which can be beneficial to police because they then get information that they may not have before.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. We're almost 5 months from when Lilly and Jack went missing.
Yep.
And we still don't know what happened to them. Why don't we know that yet?
It's a good question, and again, I don't have all the answers on that file, so it's a hard one for me to answer. I would say that it's not. There are other missing person investigations where we're kind of in the same position. You could look at the Zach Lefebvre investigation down in Yarmouth, for example. That's one from 2021. It's the same sort of thing, right? It becomes very difficult. Missing persons investigations can be very difficult, especially, we'll stand up GSAR, we'll do all those things, and most of the time they're found very quickly. When we get to a position where someone has gone potentially off into a wooded area, those types of investigations can just be difficult. You're dealing with wildlife, you're dealing with terrain, you're dealing with a lot of things that can make it very, very hard to try and find someone. So for specifically to Lilly and Jack, I really don't know. I don't have enough information to be able to give you that, but
it is still a missing persons investigation?
That's the thing. I'm not sure.
Okay.
To be honest with you, I know they are missing. Whether it's the investigations in the criminal realm, whether it's under the missing persons realm, I don't know. I don't. Yeah. Other than, like I said, doing a few interviews and chasing down some of the tips, that's all I know about the file. So.
Sure.
Yeah.
Tell me about those tips you chased down.
Yeah, so it's the same things. These tips came in, from what I remember, they were just people that happened to be following some of the information on social media. And I can't remember if there was information from the RCMP or if they read something from a media outlet. But either way, it came in for basically somebody just saw something online, they called, they provided information, and then I was assigned, as well, myself and another member, we were assigned to go talk to those people and then provide the information that they gave us back to the investigators, the main investigators, who then determine whether that's factual or not.
And
factual.
was it relevant?
I don't know.
Okay.
So that's the thing with our files is not to get into a huge big discussion about
Sure.
files in terms because it's complicated, but there are 3 people that manage the day-to-day, that manage the overall investigation. Everybody else that's involved with the investigation is assigned a task. They go chase down that task, they provide the information back, and then they're given a new task and they go back out and run that task. So they don't, other than the information they have specifically gathered, they're not privy to what the other 30 police officers are doing. Only the main investigators are privy to that information, and they're the ones that are making the decisions about where things go based on the evidence and the information that's being gathered. So unless you're in the triangle, as we call it, all I would know is the information that I gathered. I don't know what the other people gathered, so I don't know if it was accurate, factual, or not.
And just articulate again the message to the public who are consuming these shows, consuming what they see on social media. What's your message to them?
So my message to them would just be like anything. The shows, as much as they, most things, like I choose to believe that most things start from a good place. Ultimately, these are shows that are generally being created to be monetized by the creators of the show or by the creator on that platform. And that information that they're gathering, it'll be widely shared, but the fact checking is minimal or sometimes non-existent. And people do tend to believe the more that it's shared, the more factual something is. Just because something is shared a million times doesn't make it more factual. It's no more factual than if it was only shared one time. So that's all. It's just a matter of, I would just suggest any information you consume from any source is always just, kind of think about it critically and perhaps try to do your own independent, fact checking if you want to, before you kind of come to a conclusion or an opinion about, form an opinion about whatever it is that you're watching. So that's really all it is. I guess take things with a grain of salt. Probably the best way to put it.
And you mentioned YouTubers can and are monetizing this content, which some experts would say deduces the victims of crimes or the families of the victims of crime or missing persons investigations are kind of reduced to content, consumable content. Do you have ethical concerns with that, in dealing with the people who are dealing with a tragic loss or a tragic situation? For sure. I think even to boil it down to the simplest, perhaps the simplest example, a car crash, a fatal car crash on a highway, and there are people that are at the collision that are sharing photos and imagery from that collision, but the police aren't there yet and the ambulance isn't there yet, and we don't know what we have, and somebody may have died and is now in a road where we're trying to get there, we're trying to determine who they are, and then we need to find their families to inform them. Before we can do any of that, this information is already being shared, and I know from personal experience, family members have found out that their loved one was deceased on a highway from that. So it's like anything. The information that we're sharing, we don't always necessarily think about the impacts on the actual people that are living with this day to day. And that can be certainly difficult when you talk about true crime podcasts, true crime YouTube videos, any type of online platform where we're sharing and creating this kind of content. There is a family at the end of the day, or there are loved ones, there's family, there's friends, there's a whole community that is impacted by, whatever incident it is that we're discussing. And I do think that probably there are times when those people we're not, thinking enough about the impact on those people and this information being shared, and just the constant, the constant stream of the information, right? Like you can try and turn it off, but it's one of those things, we're so interconnected now that you're going to see it almost anywhere you go. So there are definitely concerns for sure. And what can that impact be?
So it can just be just on the family, right? Like, so You know, when there's a difficult thing that's happened to you, obviously the healthiest thing to do is try and deal with that, get supports to try and deal with it, and try and kind of move through it in a healthy way. But if you're constantly living in that and there's constant information just constantly being shared through the days, the weeks, the months, sometimes the years, that person is living this every day, and it's very difficult for them to get out of that cycle. So, you know, a year from now, 2 years from now, the information that gets shared, that's continuing to be shared, they're still living with that, and it makes it difficult for them to then try and move past that. Obviously, when we're talking about like police investigations, those are hard, especially missing people where we haven't found the person, because then the closure's not there, and we are keenly aware of that, and that's what we're constantly working towards, to try and get closure for family. But it does make it difficult for them when, you know, this is something that's always in the background, that is always there for them, but then it keeps being brought to the forefront constantly. And that's, I think, probably the hardest part and the hardest impact on a family, is that it consumes, it goes from being something that they're living with and trying to manage to it can consume their entire lives. And that can be very, very difficult. And it's very, very difficult for sure.